For the most part, I feel like I have grown past like rage bait, like intentional rage bait set forth, by the powers that be through. But one thing that is pissing me off is how these content creators are having this belief system that, for one, all abusers aren't bad people. And then two, saying things like we need to be in community with abusers, or if the abuser had access to services like therapy or medication management, that maybe they wouldn't have offended. And I'm just gonna say this, and this is just my humble opinion based on being a survivor of childhood abuse and witnessing people who have experienced abuse in my personal life. Number one, an abuser cannot be a good person, because choosing to abuse someone, it's a conscious choice. It is a choice that is well thought out. The person is usually targeted by the abuser because they either have very high or very low visibility, they have no protective factors, and they have already been picked by the group, the workplace, the family, the friend group, as a target. They're low on the social hierarchy. So they are intentional about who they pick to abuse. They are also intentional about who they choose to support, because abusers know that there are people with eyes on them, and they don't want, the wrong person to find out. And then they also know the people who will enable their abuse, the people who know about them being an abuser, but, they're either paid off by money, or, this abuser has, a high social standing, clout, whatever the fuck. Number two, access to services. Like, I get, both sides, I get it. But it's like, again, abuse is a conscious choice. There are abusers in therapy. There are abusers taking medications. There are abusers who are putting on the front to mental health providers, to their church, to their workplace, to other people in their family, and pretending to be this person, pretending to be the one in distress. Like, no. And I'm not saying like an abuser is different from a person with poor emotional regulation. An abuser is different from somebody who has poor, emotional or social intelligence, even though traits of abusive people usually include very poor emotional regulation, very poor emotional, intelligence, very poor social skills, but so I get it. And an abuser is not to be confused with somebody in a very toxic relationship where they're both feeding off of negativity. They're both, screaming at each other. They're both doing this. They're both doing that. An abuser is somebody who systemically or impulsively, because there are people who are, serial rapists, serial, they just beat up people. It's just, it's a choice. And medication and therapy and community involvement does not do anything, because why is it that we have pastors and, teachers and motherfucking coaches and all these respected people connected in the community with access to mental health resources, usually utilizing them, and they're still abusers. So like that bullshit, like, no, get the fuck out of here. And I get that not every person wishes harm on somebody who abuses them, and it is not anyone's place to tell a survivor of abuse, sexual assault, childhood trauma, getting beat in a marriage or a relationship, workplace abuse, friendship abuse, sibling abuse. It's not anyone's place to tell that person like how to feel about their abuser and all this other stuff. But at the same time, if that person like, oh, I forgive them and I want, whatever the case may be that they want for this person to have a second chance, like, that's not fair to everyone else, because abusers do not be sorry about the shit that they do. They don't. Okay, they're never sorry. The only thing that upsets them is getting caught. The only thing that upsets them is a survivor putting them on blast. The only thing that upsets them is controlling the narrative and their public image, and they will do whatever to maintain it. Just because they offer some fucking apology, throw some money, do some temporary band-aid, no. Like, and abuse, we need to stop looking at human behavior as just a natural thing, like, oh, this and this, because there are spiritual aspects regarding abuse, okay? It is a spiritual attack, a physical attack, you know what I'm saying, on a person's mind, body, and their spirit. Like, it's not just your physical self being harmed, you are harmed spiritually. And that is one of the reasons why many childhood abuse survivors find themselves being abused, because after people like us are abused, there is a mark on us. We are wounded spiritually, emotionally, physically, mentally, and spiritually. We are wounded, and in the spiritual world that is at play. And we just need to stop looking at abuse as just an act that is just occurring here in the natural. People abuse for many reasons. People are in ties with spiritual demonic entities that require them to abuse others. People be mixed up in a bunch of shit, witchcraft or whatever. Like, it is not just, rehabilitation, services, this and that. Like, that's why I'm just under the belief that, people who have an established history of harming women, children, and the disabled, there needs to be spiritual acts occurring, and they need to be put somewhere away from vulnerable people, okay? Because they're going to reoffend if they don't go through some type of spiritual enlightenment, like these natural man-made attempts that we have to combat abuse, these support groups and all this other stuff. I'm not saying that it's not helpful, but I'm just saying, when a person allows an abusive spirit to take over them, and the physical act of being abusive, like, it's just something that we have to really look at it from a spiritual place, and not through the lens of general religion, through Catholicism or the Christian church or whatever. Like, it is deeper than that, because in every system, every path, like, you have to be fucking vigilant. And because it is just so common. Like, it's just always something. It's always some sacrifice of an innocent soul to depopulate us and to decrease the frequency. So chaos, division, just so it can be preserved. Like, this is just deeper than that. And I know that, maybe I'm looking at things a little bit too deeply, but it's like when I examined my own family and, people, because I knew I've grown up around a lot of abused individuals, and it just was like, what is it that I'm missing? Like, and I just look at all the patterns, and I just, just look at everything, and it's like, the abuse system, it is sustained, like there's a reason for it. And when people have these laxed as standards, when they're not angry, when they're not truly disgusted at the implications, the lifelong implications that a person has to deal with after their innocence has been taken from them through whatever method of abuse, and what that does to everybody that engages with that person, and what that person might become if they're not strong, if they don't have, people interceding on their behalf in the natural and in the spiritual, like that's how the cycle keeps going. And I don't know, like, I just feel like so strongly about that shit, because it's not like, discarding people, but it's like spirits and things, they reside in people and in animals and in different things. And if a person has been left open to some type of possession, to where they are acting in an abusive nature consistently, then, that person will never, ever be safe, and I'm not, it's a difference between a certified bona fide abuser versus a person defending themselves versus a person having a hard time versus a person being in a toxic relationship, or two people just not being good for each other. Like, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people like my father who have fucked people up, who has put 2 women through substance abuse, who put my mother in an early grave. I'm talking about my mother, who decided to be male-centered and sacrificed her children, for this man. You sacrificed me, my brother, and my sisters to the state of Michigan to continue on your drug addiction. You know what I'm saying? Because you didn't want to, and all the while still being connected with him. You sat there, you knew that he was abusive, and you wanted us, you wanted us to have a relationship with him. You wanted us, like, it's ridiculous. An abuser is like my aunt who beat her children all because she was so angry about the things that the fathers did to them. You know what I'm saying? Like, you cursing their lives, you saying things like you hate them and you wish they were never born, all because you don't want to take responsibility and accountability for the fact that you chose the wrong motherfucker to fuck, and it wasn't a situation to where there weren't warning signs like, I probably shouldn't even have sex with this person. But no, you go and decide, oh, not only am I going to have sex, I'm going to do it unprotected, get pregnant, then get mad when he's not an active father. Then because I'm stuck here, now my mama dead, so I can't drop him off on her doorstep like you always say. Now you don't want to parent, you don't want to work, and then you think that every time your kids do something, your response is beat them. I'm not talking about those are certified bona fide abusers that are dangerous. And another thing, abusers have a sense of entitlement. Most abusers, they are childlike. That is something that leaves you open for possession of dark forces that will cause you to be doing things that are unsafe for yourself and for the community. And abuse usually does that, usually stunts people, at an age. My father, because that was one thing that I noticed with my father, my aunt, and most abusive people is that they still suck their fingers. So my father is in his 70s and I'm sure he is still sucking his thumb. My aunt in her 50s, still sucking her thumb. My sister died in her 30s, still sucking her finger. A person with a very abusive nature. These people are stunted at an early age, but physically they're growing up. So, you're adhering to the laws here in the physical that look at a person 18 and up as an adult. So now you have been granted privileges of an adult, but you think and operate like an 8-year-old, like a 5-year-old. And so, children, they do act entitled because they've been catered to, and parents, it is our duty to let our kids know, okay, you're being a fucking brat, putting limits, not saying yes to everything. But if you don't have your parent of a sound mind instilling values into you, you're gonna stay stuck. And usually with a trauma history, ain't nobody teaching you shit. So you carry on this childlike entitlement, where you feel like, oh, because something's gonna make you mad about what another motherfucker choose to do with their life, because it's not serving you, because things are gonna change, and you're stuck childlike, and now you're angry, and you feel like you can start being emotionally abusive, emotionally manipulative, threatening to withhold affection and love, putting people down, hitting people, being abusive, because you have this childlike sense of entitlement. Entitled people are very fucking childish. And am I saying all entitled people are abusive? No. But entitlement is another trait of an abuser. Listen, I rebuke that bullshit that people are trying to set forth. I don't know what people, if they're just trying to like desensitize people to abuse, but I am not for it, and it is extremely triggering, and it is not something that I will ever let up off of. We already got too many abusers integrated into the motherfucking community. You know what I'm saying? And how's that going for us? How's that going for us? Spouses sit in family therapy, marriage counseling all the time, but on the back end, financially abusing their families, physically abusing their families, they're on medication, yada yada yada, blase blah, blase blah, doing all the groups and the this and the that, and it's still not changing nothing, because that ain't the fucking answer. You know, and I don't want to say too fucking much, but, you know, people need to really recognize that abusive people are dangerous to everybody, because they're flying monkeys, they're enablers. Once that person stops being a good enabler, they are going to experience the same abuse that the victims did. Okay? But yeah.